Today, we reveal the real objects that touch Jesus at the cross, the tomb, and the resurrection. And 2,000 years later, they remain undeniable proof that the story of Jesus truly happened. Chapter 1. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb that changed history. Deep inside the labyrinth of Jerusalem's old city stands the massive, patched-together Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a structure that has been destroyed, rebuilt, burned, and restored more times than any other Christian shrine on earth. For almost 17 centuries, it has been the final destination of countless pilgrims who have traveled across deserts, oceans, and continents simply to kneel at the place where the body of Jesus was laid and from which he rose. The tomb itself is now enclosed within a small 19th marble shrine called the Edify. But in October 2016, after decades of diplomatic negotiation among 6 Christian denominations that share custody, a team of 50 scientists and restorers from the National Technical University of Athens was finally permitted to open the burial bench for the first time since 1555. Working around the clock for just 60 hours, they removed the modern marble cladding, then a 12th century Crusader slab engraved with a cross, and finally revealed the original broken limestone burial bench hewn from the living rock of a 1st century Jewish tomb. Carbon-14 tests on mortar samples, architectural analysis, and pottery shards from the surrounding fill all converged on a single date range. The tomb was quarried between 20 BC and AD 70, precisely the lifetime of Jesus. The bench had been deliberately shattered, probably by order of Emperor Hadrian in AD 135 when he covered the site with a pagan temple, yet the fragments remained in place and the tomb was empty, exactly as the Gospel writers insist. A mere 10 meters away inside the same building, pilgrims can reach through a hole in the floor and touch the naked rock of Calvary itself, the outcrop where the cross was planted. They climb a narrow, worn staircase to the Latin chapel above the crucifixion site, then descend again and are forced to bow almost double to enter the tiny tomb chamber, an architectural reminder that every visitor must humble himself before the mystery of resurrection. At the main entrance lies the pink stone of anointing, where tradition says Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus laid the body and anointed it with 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Even today, many pilgrims swear the stone still releases a faint, sweet fragrance when kissed. And in perhaps the most remarkable symbol of coexistence in the Holy Land, the huge iron keys to the church have been held since 1187, not by any Christian leader, but by 2 Muslim families, the Nusaybe and the Jude, who every morning and evening perform the ancient ritual of unlocking and locking the single door, a daily act of trust that has continued unbroken for over 8 centuries. 2. The Shroud of Turin. In a climate-controlled vault beneath the Royal Chapel of Turin Cathedral rests a single piece of herringbone twill linen, 4.37 meters long and 1.1 meters wide, that has been called the most studied, most argued over, and most mysterious object in the world. To the casual observer, it appears almost blank, bearing only faint, yellowish streaks. Yet on the night of 28 May 1898, when Secondo Pia was granted permission to photograph it for the first time, the developed negative plate revealed something that shook him to his core, a perfectly detailed photonegative image of a crucified man front and back, with every wound described in the 4 Gospels. More than 120 dumbbell-shaped scourge marks from a Roman flagrum with lead-tipped thongs, dozens of puncture wounds across the scalp from a helmet-like crown of thorns, nail wounds in the wrists. Not the palms, an anatomical detail unknown in medieval art. A spear wound in the right side from which blood and clear fluid flowed separately. Swollen knees from repeated falls, and a severely abraded shoulder from carrying a 35-50 kg crossbeam. Since that night, the shroud has been subjected to an intensity of scientific scrutiny unmatched by any other historical artifact. Over 170,000 hours of research, hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, and investigations by NASA, the U.S. Air Force, Los Alamos National Laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Oxford University, the French Atomic Energy Commission, Italy's ENEA, and dozens of other institutions have produced a mountain of data. The image is not made by pigment dye, scorch vapor, or any known artistic technique. It is an extremely superficial oxidation dehydration confined to the top 2,600 nanometers of the linen fibrils, thinner than a single wavelength of visible light. When the grayscale values are processed through a VP8 image analyzer, a device developed for mapping planetary topography, the body rises in perfect three-dimensional relief, something impossible for any ordinary photograph or painting. More than 50 pollen grains identified by Swiss criminologist Max Frey and later confirmed by Hebrew University botanists belong exclusively to plant species native to a 30-kilometer radius around Jerusalem, many of which bloom only in March and April. Travertine aragonite limestone, chemically identical to samples taken from the tombs near Jerusalem, has been found embedded in the foot, knee, and nose regions. The blood is real human blood type AB containing extraordinarily high levels of bilirubin produced only by extreme torture and trauma. The blood clots are intact and unbroken. The body was removed from the cloth without sliding or tearing them, an impossibility under normal decomposition. After 35 years of failed attempts to reproduce the image, scientists at Italy's ENIA Research Center, using the most powerful ultraviolet lasers available, concluded in 2011 that the only known physical mechanism capable of creating the image is an extraordinarily brief, extraordinarily intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation on the order of 34 trillion watts emanating from the body itself in less than 1/40th of a billionth of a second. In other words, the shroud appears to be a literal snapshot of the precise moment a dead body became a living, glorified one. A photographic negative created 18 centuries before photography. A three-dimensional hologram created 19 centuries before holography, and the most powerful silent witness to the resurrection ever preserved. 3. The Sudarium of Oviedo. 800 kilometers west of Turin, high in the Camera Santa of the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain, rests a far smaller and far less famous linen cloth, 453 centimeters, darkened by overlapping patterns of blood and clear fluid. Known since at least AD 614 and documented in Oviedo since 718, it is identified by an unbroken chain of historical records as the Sudarium, the face cloth mentioned in John 27, that was folded up in a place by itself inside the tomb. Unlike the shroud, it bears no image, only the raw evidence of violent death. Forensic pathologists who have studied it note that the central stain around the nose and mouth is consistent with pulmonary edema fluid mixed with blood, typical of death by asphyxiation on a cross. The pattern shows the cloth was first applied while the victim was still vertical, blood running downward, then folded around the back of the head, and finally removed when the body was laid horizontal. The beard area shows marks of being pulled. The nose is visibly broken, and there are more than 70 puncture wounds from thorns. When the 124 bloodstains of the Sudarium are digitally superimposed on the face of the Shroud of Turin, researchers have found 70 points of congruence on the front and 50 on the back. Aligning to within 2 millimeters the length of the nose, the swelling of the cheeks, the exact rivulets from the forehead, even the microscopic folds in the linen are identical. Statistically, the probability that two different crucified men in history produce these precise overlapping patterns is effectively zero. Both cloths carry type AB blood with the same rare biochemical profile. Both contain pollen from Gundelia tournefortii, the plant most likely used for the crown of thorns and other species found only around Jerusalem, and both contain particles of travertine aragonite soil chemically identical to samples taken from the Damascus Gate area. The Sudarium is the immediate post-mortem cloth used in the chaotic minutes after the body was taken down from the cross. The shroud is the final burial shroud placed over the body after it had been washed and anointed. Together, they form a continuous, scientifically corroborated forensic chain that no medieval forger could possibly have fabricated. 4. The Holy Chalice of Valencia. In a darkened chapel off the transept of Valencia Cathedral, behind bulletproof glass and shafts of golden light, stands a humble agate cup, no larger than a modern teacup, venerated by tens of millions as the very vessel Jesus raised at the Last Supper when he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." The upper stone cup, 9 cm, has been dated by archaeologists to between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. Its shape, material, and 170 milliliter capacity match exactly the blessing cups used at 1st century Jewish Passover Seders. The ornate medieval gold stem handles and jewel-encrusted base were added later, but the ancient agate vessel at its heart is the original. Its documented journey is one of the most extraordinary odysseys in Christian history, carried by St. Peter to Rome, used by the earliest popes in catacomb masses entrusted by St. Lawrence in AD 258 to a Spanish soldier from Huesca to escape Valerian's persecution, hidden in the Pyrenees for centuries, moved from cave to cave and monastery to monastery as Muslim armies swept across Spain, guarded for 400 years in the impregnable cliff-carved monastery of San Juan de la Peña, and finally brought to Valencia Cathedral in 1437, where it has remained ever since. Popes John Paul II, 1982, Benedict XVI, 2006, and Francis 2015 have all celebrated Mass with this same vessel, and every year on the last Thursday of October, it is carried in solemn procession through the streets of Valencia, while hundreds of thousands line the route in absolute silence, a tradition that turns the entire city into a cathedral for one night. 5. The True Cross. In the spring of 326 AD, Empress Helena, mother of Constantine, nearly 80 years old and burning with newly discovered faith, arrived in Jerusalem with imperial authority, unlimited funds, and an entire legion at her command. She ordered the complete demolition of the temple to Venus that Hadrian had deliberately built in AD 135 over the sites of Calvary and the tomb to erase Christian memory. Beneath layers of pagan fill, her workers first uncovered the rock-cut tomb, then only meters away a cistern containing 3 wooden crosses, the titulus board in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, and several large iron nails. 7 independent early sources, Eusebius Cyril of Jerusalem, Ambrose Rufinus Socrates, Scholasticus Sozomen, and Theodoret, all record the same miracle that identified the true one. A woman who was gravely ill, or in some versions had just died, was carried to the site. The first 2 crosses produced no effect. When she was touched by the third, she instantly opened her eyes, leapt up, completely healed, and began praising God at the top of her voice. The miracle was witnessed by crowds. The news spread like wildfire throughout the city and the empire. Macarius, Bishop of Jerusalem, immediately proclaimed the third cross to be the true cross of Christ. Helena divided the relic into 3 parts. The largest portion was encased in silver and remained in Jerusalem inside the newly built Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. A second portion was sent to Constantinople. The third she carried personally to Rome, where she enshrined it in her palace chapel that became the Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem. Over the following centuries, fragments were distributed as the most precious gifts imaginable, sent by popes to kings, by emperors to emperors, and by bishops to cathedrals. By the 19th century, skeptics mocked that the fragments could build a ship or even a house. In 1870, the French scholar Charles Rohaut de Fleury undertook the first systematic catalogue of every authenticated piece in existence. After years of travel and measurement, he calculated that the total volume of all known fragments amounted to less than 4 million cubic millimeters, barely enough for one Roman crossbeam, let alone an entire cross. The skeptics were silenced forever. The largest remaining portion is still venerated today inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, directly above the empty tomb. It once overshadowed a silent witness to the wood that bore the weight of the world's redemption. 6. The Holy Nails. Early Christian tradition recorded as far back as St. Ambrose in the 4th century, St. John Chrysostom, and later by the 5th century historians Sozomen and Theodoret is unanimous when Helena discovered the true cross in the cistern beneath Calvary in 326 AD. She also found the 4 iron nails that had held the Savior to the wood. One nail, bent and blood-stained, was immediately sent to her son Constantine and fastened into the bridle of his war horse to fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah 14:20. On that day, "Holy to the Lord" shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses. A second was incorporated into the emperor's own battle helmet or crown, giving rise centuries later to the famous Iron Crown of Lombardy. The remaining 2 were dispatched as the most precious relics imaginable to the greatest churches of the empire. Today, several ancient nails, all perfectly consistent with first-century Roman military hardware, are still venerated in major shrines around Europe, one in a crystal and gold reliquary above the high altar of the Basilica of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome, one embedded in the Iron Crown of Lombardy at Monza Cathedral, the very crown that was placed on the heads of Charlemagne Napoleon, and 34 other kings and emperors, another in Milan Cathedral, another in the Cathedral Treasury of Trier, another in the Imperial Treasury of the Hofburg in Vienna, and a few others of equal antiquity and provenance. Each is forged from wrought iron with high carbon content, typical of Roman military production measures, between 10 and 18 centimeters, has a square cross-section, and most tellingly shows the characteristic sharp bend at the tip that occurs when a heavy spike strikes a hard knot in olive wood, and the executioner simply hammers the point over rather than withdrawing it to start again. In 1968, near Givat HaMivtar in northern Jerusalem, archaeologists excavating a first-century Jewish tomb discovered the ossuary of a man named Yehohanan ben Hagkol, who had been crucified around AD 70. Astonishingly, an 11.5-centimeter iron nail was still driven straight through both heel bones. The Romans sometimes nailed the feet sideways to prolong the agony, and deep parallel scratches on the radius and ulna bones prove beyond doubt that the wrists, not the palms, had supported the body's weight, exactly the anatomical detail visible on the Shroud of Turin and completely unknown to medieval artists who invariably depicted nails through the palms. The tip of Yehohanan's nail was bent at almost precisely the same angle seen on several of the venerated holy nails, caused by hitting a knot in the olive wood cross and being hammered over. Metallurgy dimensions, corrosion patterns, and even microscopic traces of olive wood fibers still clinging to some of the relics match perfectly. When the Yehohanan discovery was published, it instantly transformed the holy nails from objects of pious legend into forensically credible artifacts. These are not random medieval spikes. They are clinically identical to the instruments used in Roman crucifixions in Judea during the very decade of Jesus' execution. One of them, bent, blood-stained, and still carrying microscopic traces of human tissue and olive wood, may well be the very iron that once pinned the hands or feet of the Son of God to the cross, an object so terrible and so sacred that it has been kissed by saints, carried into battle by emperors, hidden in royal treasuries for 17 centuries, and still exists silent and terrible in our own day. 7. The Crown of Thorns. Inside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, in a bulletproof crystal reliquary placed directly in front of the high altar, there is still preserved the woven circlet of rushes, Sisyphus spina Christi, that Roman soldiers twisted into a mock crown and forced down onto Jesus' head until blood ran in streams. The individual thorns, some up to 5 centimeters long, were gradually detached over the centuries and given away as the most precious of gifts to kings, cathedrals, and monasteries. Several individual thorns are still venerated today at Stonyhurst College in England, Pisa Cathedral in Italy, Vienna Cathedral, and many other places. Yet the original rush base remains perfectly intact, supple, and undecayed after 2,000 years. In 1238, St. Louis IX of France paid the staggering sum of 135,000 gold livres, more than half the annual revenue of the entire kingdom, to ransom the crown from the bankrupt Latin emperors of Constantinople. He personally built the breathtaking Sainte Chapelle as its permanent home, and every Good Friday the king himself would walk barefoot and bare-chested through the streets of Paris, carrying the crown on a velvet cushion in solemn procession. On the night of 15th of April 2019, as a terrifying inferno consumed the 850-year-old oak roof of Notre Dame and the spire collapsed in a rain of fire before the eyes of the world, Paris Fire Brigade chaplain, Father Jean-Marc Fournier, led a human chain of firefighters straight into the heart of the blaze. Ignoring temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius and falling beams, they smashed open the safe, seized the Blessed Sacrament and the crown of thorns, and ran out. Millions watched live as the chaplain emerged from the smoke and flames holding the relic high, completely unharmed, an image that hundreds of millions of believers instantly recognized as a modern Easter miracle. Botanical experts have confirmed the plant is the exact species that grew abundantly around Jerusalem in the 1st century, and the weaving technique is identical to that used by Roman soldiers in Judea. Every Good Friday, the Archbishop of Paris continues the ancient tradition barefoot. Carrying the crown on a white cloth, he processes around the cathedral in total silence while the faithful weep, allowing millions in our own time to touch the very pain that redeemed the world. 8. The Holy Stairs. Directly opposite the Papal Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of the Bishop of Rome and Mother Church of the World, stand 28 white marble steps protected by dark walnut wood, according to tradition recorded as early as the 4th century. These are the exact marble stairs Jesus climbed and descended several times inside Pontius Pilate's praetorium in Jerusalem, blood dripping from the scourging from the crown of thorns and from countless smaller wounds onto every step. In 326 AD, Empress Helena had each slab carefully numbered, dismantled, shipped to Rome, and reassembled exactly as they had been in the old Antonia fortress. For 17 centuries, hundreds of millions of pilgrims, from great saints such as Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Charles Borromeo, and Philip Neri, to countless nameless poor, have been allowed to climb these stairs, only on their bare knees, one step at a time, praying as they go. The marble has been worn so deeply, sometimes several centimeters, that metal protective strips have had to be installed in places. In 2019, for the first time in 300 years, Pope Francis authorized the temporary removal of the protective walnut covering for restoration. The world was able to see the original surface covered with thousands upon thousands of tiny crosses carved by medieval pilgrims and bearing dark reddish-brown stains that generation after generation have kissed and wept over as drops of Christ's own blood shed on the morning of his condemnation. Many fell to their knees and sobbed uncontrollably when they saw it. Today, thousands still queue every single day from every corner of the earth to climb the Scala Santa on their knees, joining an unbroken chain of prayer that has flowed without interruption from the day Jesus himself walked those steps until this very moment. 9. The Seamless Tunic. In the cathedral treasury of Trier, Germany's oldest city, there is carefully preserved a large ancient garment of reddish-brown wool woven in one single piece from top to bottom, without a single seam, exactly as John 19:23-24 describes. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. They said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This is the very last garment Jesus wore before he was stripped naked on the cross. Tradition records that Empress Helena brought the tunic from Jerusalem to Trier, the western capital of the Roman Empire, where she had once lived before her son Constantine became sole emperor. Because of its extreme age and fragility, it is exhibited publicly only once every few decades, most recently in 2012, when more than 2 million pilgrims came to venerate it. Modern scientific analysis has confirmed that the fabric was woven on an upright loom in a style typical of 1st century Judea, dyed with madder root, a common Middle Eastern dye of the period, and most extraordinarily is completely seamless from neck to hem, a technique so rare and expensive that such garments were usually reserved only for royalty or high priests. The tunic has become the most powerful visible symbol of the unity Christ desires for his church, that they may be one as we are one. Every time it is displayed, millions quietly queue for hours simply to gaze upon and when permitted to touch the cloth that once covered the body of the Savior in his final hours before the world stripped him bare to redeem it. 10.
The Holy Lance Spear of Longinus. In the Imperial Treasury, Weltliche Schatzkammer of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna is displayed an iron spearhead roughly 50 centimeters long with one of the best documented histories of any relic in existence. From at least the 6th century, unbroken tradition has identified it as the very lance with which the Roman centurion Longinus pierced the side of the crucified Jesus, causing blood and water to flow, a wound that matches the mark on the Shroud of Turin in size angle, and the separate streams of blood and pericardial fluid. From the time of Charlemagne onwards, European emperors treated it as the ultimate talisman of power. Legend says Charlemagne slept with it under his pillow. Henry IV carried it into battle to rally his troops. No fewer than 12 Holy Roman emperors held it in their right hand at their coronation.
Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the myth of the Spear of Destiny, annexed Austria in 1938, partly to seize it, had it secretly transported to Nuremberg and hid it deep inside a vault beneath the castle. On 30th April 1945, the exact day Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division broke into the vault and recovered the lance. General George S. Patton is said to have held it in his hands and whispered, "So this is what pierced the side of God himself." It was formally returned to Vienna in 1946, from the trembling hand of a Roman centurion who cried out, "Truly, this was the Son of God," to its quiet place in a museum case today. The weapon intended to confirm death became the instrument that opened the heart from which the lifeblood of the Church continues to flow. These 10 sacred objects, together with the empty tomb that shelters many of them, have survived fire, war, revolution, exile, and every form of modern scientific examination. They have been kissed by saints, carried by emperors, analyzed under electron microscopes, and prayed before by countless millions. 2,000 years after Calvary, they stand as quiet yet overwhelming witnesses. He suffered, he died, and on the 3rd day he rose. The tomb is empty, the evidence is not.